And you're good.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Brian Calley, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan. Welcome to the Small Business Briefing.
And I'm Kelly Saunders, Vice President of Policy and Engagement here at SBAM, and I am filling in for Sarah Miller today. We'll kick off our program with welcoming a new member. Thank you to Technology Resource Group out of Troy, Michigan. They joined as a VIP member, and they are focused experts on automotive mobility and propulsion, IT, and software and infrastructure. So, welcome to the SBAM family out of Troy, Michigan. So, Brian, we'll kick off the show today. Never a shortage of things to talk about. But starting with some good news, there is a new study regarding the economic impact of tourism in Michigan. And we know the industry is dominated by small businesses. So, what did that study reveal?
Yeah, this was actually a pretty in-depth and impressive study that looked at the impact of tourism, the industry itself in Michigan from a lot of different angles. Let's just talk top line to start with. A $54.8 billion economic impact. This is for the year 2024 that the study covered. So if you were to kind of think about that in terms of visitors, of course, tourism means visitors to Michigan. Overall, 131.2 million visitors traveled to Michigan during that time period. Those visitors spent 30.7 billion on their travels. That was up almost 5%, 4.9% from the 2023 number, which was 29.2 or 29.3 billion. And it also, all that activity pays returns in a lot of different ways, but the study even called out the impact in terms of state and local tax revenue that was generated because of those visits at $3.6 billion. I think it's important to recognize this because there is a public investment in our tourism industry, chiefly around Pure Michigan, and it's a fairly modest investment depending on the year, 15 to 25 if you include match locals, maybe $40 million a year. So when you think about the overall economic impact of tens of billions of dollars, of course, that's an impressive return. It's not all just tied to Pure Michigan, but it's just an example of kind of the headline thing that government does. But then the return back to government, just because all the people are with sales tax and income taxes and that sort of thing that are tied to the activities around it, the return to the state is pretty obvious, and to local governments. If you were to break it down by day, spending on tourism, $84.2 million per day. And if you were to consider that originally that $30.7 billion total, the biggest players in that are transportation and the food and beverage industries, about 7 billion each, so almost half in those two. And then the the jobs, there's a section here. Let me just get down to the part about GDP and jobs. So if you look at the top line economic numbers there, GDP increase to Michigan 26.1 billion in that year. It's about 3.7% of our overall economy, which it sounds like a small percent, but it's not. It's massive. Consider how much happens here, and about 351,000, a little more than that, jobs contributing to tourism and the visitor industry in Michigan in this past year. It supports about 1 in 17 jobs in the state, including 96,000 in the food and beverage industry. And I always feel like we are defending the that industry a lot. Is dominated by smalls, and sometimes in the government world, they kind of downplay the value that is brought to the table by that industry. And these are awesome employers that are doing lots of innovative things, and the economic impact is huge. And people do make careers in those industries. Now, those 351,000 jobs, they actually, it was kind of nice. They separated it out from direct jobs and then additional kind of indirect jobs, jobs that exist because those direct jobs. So, for example, or that of that 351,000 number overall, 230, almost 231,000 direct jobs, um, meaning specifically in the tourism industry, the people that have those direct jobs, not spin-off jobs, not jobs that are, those other numbers are kind of squishy, but the hard numbers just on their own, pretty impressive. There's a lot of economic studies, and I shared this one with some of the other ones I haven't, because this is one of those industries that is that small businesses are the dominant player in, and I think can take a lot of pride in that impact.
Well, we know we're seeing a lot of people in our communities as everyone tries to squeeze the last little bit of summer out of this time. Made a trip to up north myself, and we know that our friends in northern Michigan really get inundated during this time, but the customer service, specifically of our small businesses, are high level. But we are a tourism industry all days of the year. And the northern Michigan, specifically up in the UP during snowmobile season. So let's make sure that we continue to invest in our small businesses year round. So let's move over to the legislature now. You and I both have not held back that it's very hard to land a new budget right now, and we have no new news when it comes to landing that. But revenues are projected to decline. So can you pull back the curtain a little bit on why that is?
Yeah, the state's revenues are tied to economic activities, but also when it comes to income tax revenues, they're tied to the federal tax code. So if you've ever done your own tax returns in Michigan, you know that you first calculate your federal tax base, and that carries over to your Michigan income tax return. And so when the federal government makes changes, it can have a downstream effect on your state taxes. All right, that's true on the individual income tax, also the corporate income tax. The Since the tax code changes in with the federal government, they've done things like accelerated depreciation. And so these could have big impacts in early years, but it actually gets made up in later years because you take more of the deduction for the current expenses in the current year. That means that less is saved for out years. So new fiscal agency projections show that revenues will be impacted here at the state level by more than 600 million, 677 million for the upcoming 25-26 fiscal year, which will start on October 1st. So they're already grappling with this budget. It's more kind of political disagreements at this point as opposed to revenue disagreements. But um, when you insert lesser revenues, it makes landing a budget that much more difficult. And the but if you look at those projections on the federal tax changes and the impact that they'll have on the state income tax revenue streams, the that impact will decrease over time. In the 26-27 fiscal year, it would fall back to 613 million. There's an assumption that there really is an assumption, it's kind of a dynamic environment where there will be more capital investments because it will be incentivized. So some of this cost, I think, is um, it might be overstated in that the activity might not have otherwise happened, if you know what I mean. So um, investing in capital equipment, reshoring of operations. So it's hard to nail down like what the true cost to Michigan is. The state is foregoing additional taxable income because investments might be moved up. It's deduction in the current year. But maybe the investment wouldn't have happened otherwise. And so other economic activity may have been less. It's hard to nail these things down. But then it would drop off to 444 million in the 27-28 year, and then just to 46 million by the time you get out to out years beyond normal depreciation schedules of 2033 and 34. And so the reason I wanted to bring this up, though, is that I do believe that we will have some defense to play because of this. So this is a temporary impact. The federal government made changes to give a more generous depreciation option to people that are making capital investments. And people are going to make more capital investments likely because of that. But while it looks like the state's going to lose money, they really gain that money back because those deductions in the current year will not be saved to later years. So in later years, the impact trails off, and actually the state would see potentially even higher revenues in the future because of it. Um, One thing I think we're going to have to really guard against is the state trying to go down the road of decoupling from the federal tax code. In other words, saying, well, you got this tax benefit and we don't want that to impact state. So let's decouple and just we'll do it would and just invent our own tax base so that essentially what they would be saying is that, hey, the feds are going to lower your taxes temporarily, or I should say they're going to accelerate the benefit of capital investments so you get more upfront as opposed to having to wait for it. I think there's some risk that that decoupling would say, hey, you're saving money with the feds, you should give some of your savings to the state. That's that would kind of undo the stimulus impact. And I think why we have to be really careful about not letting this happen, not even opening the door a crack for this, is because we are operating in a very competitive environment. And Michigan has a lot at stake, especially for capital investments. And so if investing here in Michigan means that you don't get the benefit of the improvements made in the federal tax code, then people aren't going to invest as much here. It's just capital is a very fickle thing. It will go to the place of least resistance. And so we have to be real careful, I think, in this case, not to let the current pressures of the budget and the fact that the federal changes will impact state government some. If you look at the whole thing, it's more than an $80 billion budget. So 677 million it's a lot of money, but percentage of the whole total, it's not that much that they can't just deal with it. Really need to guard against decoupling here.
So let's move on to a topic that you and Sarah started last week but ran out of time for, which was the Fed's decision to maintain higher interest rates. We'll give you a chance to dive into that a little bit deeper since you didn't get the chance last week.
Yeah, one thing, if you're not like a Fed watcher, I've been watching the Fed ever since my first career was in banking. I was 11 years in the banking industry. And that was during a time actually of tightening fiscal policy, some inflation threats in the 1990s when they ramped up interest rates and then later brought them back down. It definitely cooled the economy when they did that. And that was the point. Cool the economy and then lower the rates as inflation became less of a threat. One thing, though, that is true about the Federal Reserve is that the Federal Reserve Board of Directors, not talking about the regional offices here, but the Federal Reserve Board of Directors, the central board, they normally operate in unison, meaning that there are 11 members, and the votes on what to do with interest rates are normally 11-0. So they're unanimous in the way that they vote. And this last time, when the decision was made to keep the rates level, it was 9-2. And say, well, it's still lopsided in favor of keeping the interest rates at the current place. It's still very unusual for there to be dissension, open dissension on the board. But I'm not particularly surprised that dissension is happening now because the tightening of the monetary policies of reducing the balance sheet and also keeping interest rates high is something that is out of step with the historical behavior of the Federal Reserve. If you were to look back, you'd find that in the last four times, going back to the 1980s, that they've really had a place where interest rates were increased to deal with inflation. This is highly, highly unusual for inflation to have come down this much and to maintain below 3% for this long and have the Fed still keep the rates higher. And so I've just been kind of digging like what is going on here, and just a few insights. Um, the Fed said that recent data showed economic growth moderated in the first half of 2025, while the labor market remains solid and inflation remains somewhat elevated. We're going to look at data Monday and see why that characterization, the way that they have characterized it, doesn't actually match with the data, which is again, highly unusual for the Federal Reserve to for their words to not be so well connected to the data. Like they're talking about data, and then you look at the charts and think, what are they looking at? It doesn't look the same. It's why I think you're starting to see some dissension. Um, they did make a statement. I think enough people are now questioning this. And I know there's a big high profile thing between the chair of the board, Powell, and President Trump. If you set that aside, just obviously there's these two guys have some issues between them. But just to set that aside, just look at the data. There's enough people that are questioning, like, what is the Fed seeing that everybody else is missing? And so they actually did their statement when they made the decision reaffirmed that all future decisions will be data driven, assessing incoming economic information before any policy change. They also signaled that they will continue shrinking their balance sheet, which is again, interest rates get all the attention, but that's the other way, putting less dollars out to be into the mortgage market in particular, has a cooling effect on the market as well. Powell described the current stance as modestly restrictive. If you are a person who has a capital intensive business, you will find these words to be puzzling. I think they're not modestly restrictive. I mean, they're modestly restrictive compared to the 1980s when inflation had gone like really bonkers for a while. But but really, compared to the 1990s, this is more than modestly restrictive, especially when you consider the length of time interest rates have been elevated. It's one thing to go this high for a little while, but to keep them this high for this long is what makes the description of modestly restrictive, I think, just inaccurate and or at least misleading. Um, and still the words are so concerned about inflation. Again, looking at the charts, it's hard to see why that's the main, especially comparing it to the jobs report. Now, to be fair, this decision was made a couple days before the jobs report decreased all the numbers. And so I think that the Federal Reserve will be hard pressed not to make a change now. But even so, the GDP numbers that came out after the jobs report was declined, looked pretty solid. And so will the Fed look at the GDP and say, well, yeah, labor market's cooling, but GDP looks solid still, so they're going to keep the rates elevated. I'd say at this point, I'll be very surprised if they don't have to acquiesce now and admit that the monetary policies are too restrictive and that the risk of a recession is higher than the risk of inflation. Almost everybody else has already been at that conclusion for a long time. And I fear that the Federal Reserve is so concerned about looking like they caved into political pressure from the president that they're erring, and I think they are erroring on the side of tighter fiscal policy, just so they don't look like they're caving into political pressure. But the data really does justify lowering interest rates. So we'll see what happens. They don't meet again until September. This is ironically, I think it is the longest period between two meetings is the period that we're in right now, but just the way that the schedule lined up. So we'll see if I'm right about that. But at this point, I will be absolutely shocked if they don't start reducing interest rates because there's not even a straw to grasp now in terms of justification for leaving them how they are.
Well, puzzling, in some instances frustrating, and to be determined on what happens next. So we'll look for your report in September once that happens, and we'll gauge if you were correct or not. But Usually you are, so we'll see. Let's switch to an announcement that was made last week from a pretty storied company in Michigan. I'm from West Michigan, and I know it was maybe not a shock as this company has changed over time, but Steelcase was acquired by an external company not from Michigan. And so, why don't you tell us what happened with Steelcase last week?
Yeah, this is something that if you are a watcher of the industry, you've known that this is a possibility, has been a possibility for a while. But Steelcase, who makes primarily office furniture and is located in Grand Rapids, a very storied history there, Furniture Town, USA. Um, this it's it's so while it's not a surprise, it is another movement away from Michigan being kind of a mecca for major corporate headquarters. And that's why I wanted to bring it up. We talked a few months ago about um, Kellogg, Kellogg Company being purchased, in that case by an international company. This is still a domestic company. I think they're from Iowa. So it's called HNI Corporation. And they're an office furniture manufacturer, so a competitor of Steelcase. And it's a $2.2 billion deal. It's cash and stock. So those who own stock in Steelcase will receive $7.20 per share. And then also they will receive 0.2191 shares, so about a fifth of a stock for every one that they own in Steelcase of this HNI corporation. And so it won't be the headquarters anymore. They'll still, in the way that they're talking about, always, whenever there's an acquisition like this, there is there's they try to really reassure the community that used to host the HQ that they're still going to be there. It's going to be important. It's going to make stuff. It's going to be important to the future of the company. And only time will tell whether or not that ends up being the case. It definitely creates a risk at least for the corporate activities that currently happen in Grand Rapids. Now, overall, 64% H&I will shareholders or so in other words, the company H&I will own 64% of Steelcase, and shareholders will own the other 36. So it's definitely it's a controlling interest by a lot. And so one maybe will be uh, good, I presume probably good for overall for H&I and kind of for the overall industry competitiveness. But for West Michigan, it's a risk that will play out over time. But just one more movement away from corporate HQ activities in Michigan, which is unfortunate. While it's debatable how big the downside is, there is no upside.
Let's move to another company. I covered this when you were out one week, the Saunders deal in Genesee County, the chip steel that the governor really wanted. Um, we didn't dive in necessarily to all the metrics because at that time they had not completely been released, but maybe give your synopsis on that. And I still harken back to when the governor announced that, and the company announced they were not going to move forward with the deal. The governor was in DC this past week and he had said to her, I'll get you a better deal than that. And so we'll see what happens with that site, but maybe pull back the curtain again on this one to talk about what the metrics really were and was it really good for Michigan or not?
Yeah, well, first is this site. This is actually a really attractive site when it comes to its kind of location in the state and connection to infrastructure and just how the size of it, and then in Michigan's industrial base. It's still extremely controversial in that township, as Mundy Township in Genesee County. So I think that the community opposition seems as strong as ever and probably did have a lot to do with the company pulling out, especially when you look at the eye-popping uh, incentives that were on the table. But before we get to that, the state did spend $260 million to assemble this huge tract of land. So that's still that's still the case. It's still something that is in state control, 13-acre, they call it mega site. And again, they say Flint, but it's really in a township near Flint. It's a greenfield development. The total amount for these 9,400 jobs that ScanDisk was claiming that they would bring was $1.9 billion dollars. If you just do the math, it's $660,000 for every job promised on the project. 660,000 per job. And that's a lot, obviously, and it still wasn't enough to land the deal. The reason I mention this is because while that's not really we don't get involved in those deals, that type of economic development is just not obviously something that is relevant to small businesses in most contexts. There might be some additional business that some small businesses get off those types of developments, but I wanted to just provide the kind of the juxtaposition of the value of locally grown businesses. If you think about what it would what would happen if with that level of commitment and investment to the success of small businesses that are already here on the ground, the impact of that is would be so massive. And the cool thing about entrepreneurs, they don't walk around with their hands out. They don't expect they're going to get something from nothing in most cases. And so they're just out there providing literally half of the jobs. Small businesses providing half of the private sector jobs in Michigan, um, just on their own, making good stuff happen. And that's the place to bet. They're still going to go after the big deals, and I understand why they go after those big deals, and some of them are good reasons, and some of them I think are shaky reasons why they do that. But at the end of the day, we will continue to make the case that the better value is in homegrown businesses that are individuals who have already decided to make Michigan their home. They've already decided to plant their economic roots here. And now it's just a matter of are they going to be successful or not? And the more that we can do to invest in their success or to create an environment where they could be successful, the better off we'll be, uh, even without $660,000 incentives per job.
Amen to that. So we have just a few minutes left here. I'm going to let you decide where you want to spend your time, but we continue to try and educate people on the graduated income tax petition that is being circulated, and then you have Data Monday. So wrap it up for us,
All
if you
right,
mind.
I'm going to share with you just an example here, and this example is a is just I want people to know when I say that taxable income is a terrible way to um, uh, to determine how much money somebody has, a small business owner in particular, how rich they are. I just want to give you an example. In this case, we're talking about, I've got cash flow on one side and I got taxable income on the other side. And same company, same $1 million in revenue. Okay, this is a an example that I've just constructed using actual tax rates, but it's actually based on a conversation that I had with one of our members about the impact of how taxable income is calculated. So cash flow here, here's the money they made. They had $850,000, 85% of that went to payroll, but that was classified as research and development payroll. And so they had gross income of 150,000, overhead expense at 10%, so net profit margin of 50,000. But look over here at taxable income. Well, because that 850,000 was research and development dollars, they had to spread it over 5 years. They can only deduct 170,000 in the first year. So their net taxable income was 830,000. Now they did have overhead expenses. Remember that 10% over here? They get to deduct that. Taxable income shows at 730,000. Well, they paid federal and state income taxes, and so people look at their tax return and say, Well, what are these people complaining about? They get $428,000. Well, no, they didn't get 428,000 because remember over here, actual cash flow was that their net profit margin was 50,000. They still had to pay all these taxes, 270,000 and 31,000. So their actual cash flow is negative. They lost 250,000. That's how radically different cash flow and taxable income can be. That's why we will shout from the rooftops and continue to proclaim that this madness of saying that small business owners are rich because they have 500 or $1 million in taxable income is a farce because it is not uncommon for the tax code to disallow their deductions or make them spread those deductions over many years. And so they can have big tax bills in times when they have no cash flow. So it's not fair that they're required um, to do this. I want to the other thing I want to share with you, just I'll run through it real quick. Here's inflation. See, core inflation and headline inflation been below 3% for some time now. Look at historically here, it's not that elevated over this long period of time when you very rarely had interest rates high. You didn't have them high for this long. Um, and then the I get my computer to respond. Here's the month over month, the same stuff, but looking at the month over month details. Again, you'll see kind of a ramp down generally over time and pretty consistently at that level. They say, well, it's not 2%. Yeah, but it's been between 2 and 3% for a long time. Looking at the categories month over month, you'll see that all items averaged 0.3% and the annualized number 2.7%. Again, not, yes, it's not the target rate of 2, but it's not the sort of thing where we should be treating it as though it's 10% inflation. And then looking at the wage tracker, the Atlanta Fed publishes this for the nation, and you'll see wages coming down for the highest earning quartile. They're holding up a little better, but wages are definitely the rate of increase of wages is falling. Unemployment duration of 27 weeks and up is going up. Okay, so those are long-term unemployment, more than a half of a year. And then here's the jobs report for last month. And you'll see it split out here between goods producing and service. And there's plenty of negatives, but look at you've got business professional services starting to really hear about that more in manufacturing. Two big ones here. Health and education still kind of leading the way. And then looking at revisions, lots of talks about revisions. This downward revision, there was, of course, you go back to 2020 in the pandemic period, there were big, huge revisions. But, and you see this big up revision here. But this is kind of an unusually large revision downward, more than 250,000, just showing that on the chart. And then the final thing, now you saw the revision of the jobs way down, yet unemployment really only went up a tenth of a percent. Why would that be? One of the reasons, because the labor force itself has shrunk. The civilian labor force that is foreign born. Okay, so think of immigrant labor. You see that coming down, and obviously not surprising as well. But that's when you see even when jobs go down, if the size of the workforce is shrinking, you won't see it hit the unemployment rate in the same way. So lots of different angles to look at, but I think if you look at all of that, your conclusion would be the Federal Reserve ought to be more concerned about a recession than they are about inflation, which means that in September, I think we'll see a decrease in interest rates. The question is how much, probably 0.25%, but we shall see.
Well, that is our show for today. As we said, never a lack of news or things to talk about. Really appreciate you being with us today, and we hope you have a great week.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.